Can ChatGPT teach me Unity in one day? That's the question I asked myself 24 hours ago, having never touched Unity nor C Sharp. A day later, I had made a basic yet functioning space shooter game. So I wanted to make a quick video to summarize my process and share some takeaways about this project. I started off by asking ChatGPT to be my expert teacher and to teach me the basics of Unity by making a small game project. I explained to it that I didn't even have Unity installed, nor had I ever worked with C Sharp. I did mention, however, that I had 6 months of programming experience. ChatGPT assured me of its confidence I could pick up C Sharp quickly due to its similarities with Java. Thanks, Teach. It decided on a top-down space shooter game. Then it provided me with a rough agenda of what we would do, including installation instructions. I installed Unity without too many issues, although I had to do some additional installs with Visual Studio later on. It also linked me to some free assets I could download to get me started. The instructions were pretty vague, and I immediately had to ask how I can create an empty game object. It pointed me to the hierarchy panel, and shortly after that I had my player object. Next, I had to add a sprite renderer, which wasn't too difficult once I had chosen which ship I wanted to represent the player. Then told me to proceed to the bullet prefab. But sensei, what the hell does a prefab mean? Apparently, it's short for prefabricated and is a reusable game object with predefined components and properties. These are required to create and manage multiple instances of the same object in a scene. We're going to be firing a lot of bullets, so that makes sense. I followed the instructions to create a bullet and skipped the optional step of more components for now. After adding the background, I had some questions. Do I just drag it out? ChatGPT suggested I either drag it out or tile it to fill the space. Since I didn't want the image to be distorted, I wanted to follow suggestion number 3. The instructions on how to create the script were good enough, and I linked my script to the player. Here I had to ask for some extra instructions on how to tile the background. I had to go back and forth on this a little bit since the instructions weren't completely accurate initially. Still, I managed to figure it out and had a wonderful purple background. To ensure I learned some C Sharp, I started asking some basic questions about the syntax. It was important for me at this stage to understand every line of the code and really take my time with the process instead of blindly copy-pasting. I then received a basic script to manage the movement of the player. Unsurprisingly, I had some questions. I wanted to know what a vector3 object holds. Calling position on transform, and I was wondering whether this was something that we just inherit from mono behavior. I also didn't see any key input listeners and was confused by that. Also, why are we multiplying by delta time? Apparently, vector3 class represents a 3D vector with x, y, and z components. The delta time represents time in seconds elapsed since the last frame and ensures smooth movement, which makes sense. It also seemed that Unity could handle the default key inputs for horizontal and vertical movement on its own, and I was pointed to the project settings where I could get this verified. That's cool. I tested running the game and my spaceship could fly. However, it was always pointing in the same direction and I wanted it to rotate with my mouse. I was given the function rotate towards mouse along with a bullet script. Naturally, I had a lot of questions about the syntax and also asked ChatGPT to start leaving comments on each line of the code so that I could ask fewer questions moving forward. So, we're taking the main camera object, calling screen to world point function, and passing in the mouse position, which converts it to world coordinates. I was confused about why we don't just use a vector2 class in our 2D game and manually set z to 0. Apparently this is for consistency with Unity's inner workings, which sounded weird, but okay. Direction explanation also made sense. By subtracting mouse position from player position, we get a resulting vector for the distance. We then call normalized on it to get a length of 1 since we only really care about the direction and not the actual distance. We then calculate the angle in radians and convert it to degrees. My linear algebra skills have since long decayed, so I might not be grasping this entirely correctly, but you can refer to my exceptional paint skills for how I try to visualize this for myself before I moved on. Moving on to the bullet, transform up is apparently shorthand for a preset vector object, vector 010, which seemingly makes it point in the direction that is up for the bullet, which should be the direction it was initially shot at, which sort of makes sense. The next portion of the code was easier to understand. We create a reference to the bullet prefab, set a fire rate, and a variable to calculate time since last shot. We increase this variable every update and introduce a check to see if the player is pressing the shooting button and if the cooldown has passed. If so, we shoot. This instantiates a bullet using the instantiate method, which is useful when creating multiple instances of an object. We first pass the original object to clone, which will be our bullet prefab, along with our ship's position and rotation to match the orientation. This ensures that whatever the current rotation of the ship is when we take the shot, the bullet is going to match that. We also set its forward direction to match the ship's forward direction, and then the bullet controller handles its movement and eventual demise from there. At this point, GPT's original plan would have me move on to the UI text elements to display score and whatnot, but we still don't even have enemies and our camera does not move together with our ship's movement. So we instantiate a camera follow script that we will apply to the main camera, which follows the player. The result was a pretty jittery movement. Commenting out the smoothed position provided by my teacher seemed to fix the jittery movement. Next, we create an enemy game object, give it a sprite renderer, and add collision to it. We also give it a tag enemy so that we can reference to it in our scripts later. We then have to make the enemy into a prefab just like we did with the bullets because we're going to be spawning many of them. Then we create an enemy spawner script, which will control how enemies spawn. I asked GPT to spawn them not too close to the player. We connect the spawner to the enemy prefab, set a spawn rate, and a minimum spawn distance. The script finds the position of the player and invoke repeating method keeps calling spawn with our predetermined values. I actually struggled quite a while with this script to make the enemies appear, but eventually moving the background layer to the back fixed it. Next, I tried to add walls to the edges of my game and ran into a lot of problems. Kept going in circles with ChatGPT for a while here. Ultimately, I managed to fix it by adding the rigid body component to both the player and a box collider to the wall. Adding collision logic between bullets and the wall wasn't hard by making bullets into rigid bodies as well, and by adding logic to destroy bullets upon collision. However, this introduced a bug that made my ship go backwards and the bullets go sideways. It seemed like all of GPT's suggestions at this point made the outcome worse. For example, making bullets body type kinematics solved the issue but removed the collision detection. Without much help from GPT and after a good long think, I figured the issue stemmed from the fact that we are spawning the bullets in the same position as the ship's location. Since both are rigid bodies, they immediately crash into each other upon firing. I floated this theory to GPT and we managed to have a breakthrough. Creating a bullet spawn point as a child of the player and moving it in front of the player fixed the problem. Implementing some collision logic between the bullets and the enemies and tracking a score upon such events wasn't too hard to implement. Getting the score to actually display, however, was a long and drawn out process that I won't dive into too much, as it took well over an hour of debugging. GPT's provided code and instructions, even one followed directly didn't lead me to correct solutions, and it turned into quite a grind. Eventually, I got it to work. Enemy movement was surprisingly easy. The enemies have a speed just like the player. They find the player's location, create a vector to determine a direction, and then they move towards that location. Next, I wanted to implement start and end screens, and an ability to reset the game. I generated a cool little background with the Mid-Journey AI, but that was only the start of my struggles. Implementing a start screen and a way to restart the game once again took me down a several-hour rabbit hole, as GPT's initial instructions ended up being far from the optimal solution, and ultimately very different from what we finally went with. It seemed like GPT struggled to keep up with what I wanted to do, and something that seemed pretty simple in theory ended up taking me several hours of debugging. Since I am such a new beginner, it's entirely possible that my instructions were also suboptimal. In the end, I had to really familiarize myself with the provided code and isolate issues myself, as my teacher struggled to identify the problems based on my descriptions and me copy-pasting the code back to it. Here, it continuously uttered apologies for the confusion. I am not quite sure who was more confused at this point, the language model or me. Still, I managed to get there in the end and had a game loop with the basic functionalities that I wanted. This was roughly 10 to 14 hours of work, so I decided to end the experiment there. So, was this a good idea? Did I learn more using ChatGPT as my tutor than following a Unity tutorial? Well, it's difficult to say. I certainly feel like I have a much better grasp on Unity than I did a day ago. I got to familiarize myself with the UI, learned a little C#, and learned what components, scenes, and game objects are. That being said, there was a lot of frustration along the way. even being someone who has no game dev experience. By the end of this project, I could tell that quite a few of GPT's game design decisions were weird and suboptimal. Due to my lack of experience, I couldn't quickly spot the errors it was making and point it in the right direction, so it turned into quite a grind. I certainly see how GPT can be a powerful tool in the hands of a more experienced Unity developer who has the required terminology to clearly communicate the output they expect. For someone like myself, developing more fundamentals through tutorials for a week or so would likely have enhanced my experience a little, but I'm happy to have learned a thing or two anyway. All right, everyone, that is it. I hope you enjoyed the video. I certainly enjoyed making it and learning a little bit about Unity. Even though I'm no expert, it was nice to learn a thing or two. And please let me know in the comment section down below what you thought about the video, what you thought about this experiment. Like and subscribe, and I'll see you around.